Hello, this is From Caracas and I am Rey Gómez. On the International People's Assembly that took place here in Caracas, I'm going to talk with Ricardo Vaz, political analyst and editor at Venezuela Analysis. How are you, Ricardo?
I'm very well, thanks. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you for being here. What are the lines of action and the charter of the International People's Assembly?
Well, so the International People's Assembly that took place in Caracas in recent days was a very interesting and very timely event given the current context in Latin America and the immediate context in Venezuela. So just to give a few ideas, it had 500 delegates from 87 countries. This included a 200-strong youth delegation that was actually here for a week before the assembly took place, and they got to visit several different experiences and engage in voluntary work. So the youth brigade was actually called Che Guevara. It was no coincidence. And then we had this International Assembly from the 24th to the 27th, which was very productive in developing solidarity with the Bolivarian Revolution at a time where the attacks coming from US imperialism are getting stronger. So if I were to summarize the main conclusions, the first is mobilization. So we have to continue and improve our mobilization around the world. So for example, on March 16th, there's going to be an international day of action in defense of peace and in defense of sovereignty in Venezuela. So anyone who's watching us should look up the events closer to where they are.
Why do people need to defend all that you just have mentioned, sovereignty here in Venezuela, for instance?
Well, first of all, I think anyone who considers himself or herself on the left needs to uphold these principles of sovereignty and self-determination of the peoples. I mean, it's completely unthinkable and unacceptable that the United States is going to decide who the president of Venezuela is. So this is a very dangerous moment where the regime change operation has gone into overdrive. And so it's important not just to defend the people of Venezuela, but to defend in general this principle of sovereignty, that it is the people themselves who hold the right to choose their own leader, so not any foreign powers. So mobilization was one. A second one was political articulation. So this was a point that was emphasized by João Pedro Stedile from the Landless Workers Movement.
Brazilian leader.
Yes, and the Landless Workers Movement was also very much involved in preparation and organization of the assembly. And he was saying that, you know, we need a broad anti-imperialist international alliance if we are going to fight back against the current offensive that's taking place. And so we need to coordinate with all kinds of organizations, not just stick to the traditional political parties and trade unions, so that we can broaden this defense of sovereignty and self-determination. So, for example, one idea is to contact groups of lawyers who can expose the illegal nature of some of the attacks that are taking place against Venezuela. That's one. And finally, one very important dimension to all of this, which is the media. And so there were several media outlets that were present at the assembly. The one where I work at, Venezuela Analysis, was one of them. People's Dispatch, Brazil de Fato, NewsClick were others. And so there's also a need for us to coordinate among us, not just to have a unified message, but also to fight back, because there's kind of a unanimous propaganda in the mainstream media when it comes to Venezuela.
And the social networks too.
And which then gets translated and amplified in social media. And so it's important for us to also coordinate and offer a counter-narrative so that people can have access to a better perspective of reality in Venezuela, and then they can draw their own conclusions, which will then help in the efforts to mobilize and oppose aggression against Venezuela.
But I've read you have been here before. Tell us about your experience as an international observer in the past presidential elections on May the 20th.
Yeah, so I had the chance to be here in Venezuela last year. I was here for more than the presidential elections. I was here for more than a month. But yes, I was happy to be invited to witness the electoral process. And, you know, I reported on it. The electoral process in Venezuela is very much as close to foolproof as you can imagine. And so the simple fact of explaining how the electoral process works is already, let's say, 90% of the work to rebut all these allegations that the processes are fraudulent or that Maduro stole the elections, which you hear again and again. and which have no basis in actual evidence. So I got to visit several electoral centers here and in and around Caracas. So I was in Cati, I was in Petare, I was in El Valle, also in middle-class areas.
Many popular places here in Caracas.
Yeah, so I was in these popular neighborhoods. I also visited middle-class neighborhoods in Chacao and Paraíso. And my conclusions, and I was not alone, I was with the Venezuela analysis team, was very much what the results then showed later. You know, there was a significant participation, although lower than in previous contests, from the Chavista sectors, and a very high abstention from the opposition, which was caused by this ridiculous decision to boycott the process altogether. And just to make a small parenthesis, there were several allegations of irregularities and, you know, a lot of controversy on these supposed puntos rojos, the red tents.
The red points, or the red tents, yeah.
But, you know, we were there at the electoral center, and we also talked to, you know, the representatives from the opposition candidates who were there. They are present in every voting booth, from both Javier Bertucci and Henry Falcon, who ran against Maduro. And even though, you know, some of them complained that the red tents were closer than, you know, the 200 meters that were stipulated, but they laughed at the idea that somehow this would have any significant impact on the results.
Interesting. So why the so-called Group of Lima, the United States, insists on threatening to overthrow Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro being democratically elected, as you have just said?
Well, I wouldn't analyze the Group of Lima or the Lima Group or the Lima Cartel, as some like to say, independently, because we have to remember that the Lima Group emerges out of the Organization of American States. So the Organization of American States for a long time was trying to apply the democratic charter against Venezuela in the efforts of interference against Venezuela. And this was very much led by the OAS Secretary Luis Almagro, but they never had the necessary votes, and so they formed this kind of ad hoc international group that was just self-declared, the Lima Group, with the sole purpose of you know, advancing this regime change agenda in Venezuela. So in that sense, I would not set it apart from what has been the U.S. campaign to get rid of the Chavista government that traces back 20 years. So and this for me has two main causes. One, which is obvious and that's the one that's mentioned most often, is natural resources. I mean, Venezuela is a blessed country in terms of natural resources. It has the largest oil reserves. It also has gold, coltan, and several other minerals. So that's a reason for interest from the United States, especially given the policies of using these resources for the benefit of the people that were initiated by Chavez. So that was one. And the other is that here, you know, despite all the difficulties and contradictions, there was a very clear idea that we're going to build an alternative project, a socialist project, and that's very much a threat to U.S. influence in the region. So the constant hostility that we have seen from the United States in 20 years, and which has been severely escalated in recent months, has to do both with trying to control natural resources and at the same time destroying the idea that there is an alternative project to neoliberalism that's being imposed not only in Latin America but throughout the world.
There has been a recent escalation, and not only out of Venezuela but also at its border with Colombia very recently. What do you think of it? Well,
Colombia has always been, let's say, the main base for the extension of U.S. influence in the region, and so in that sense, its proximity to Venezuela makes it a natural point of attack. And so what we saw most recently on February 23rd was an attempt to violate the Venezuelan borders under a guise of quote-unquote international aid. So this was very explicitly an attempt to challenge the sovereignty of the Bolivarian government with an international aid that we must say is ridiculous, you know. So
US. Why is it ridiculous?
So I always like to present these numbers. So USAID pledged $20 million in aid to Venezuela, and you know, if we take into account a conference that recently took place, the total is 100 million. Now, if we compare just the latest round of sanctions that was imposed in late January, this was announced by the Treasury Department, which is effectively an oil embargo. John Bolton himself said that these measures would cost Venezuela $11 billion over the year 2019. So $11 billion is $30 million per day. So the amount that the United States pledged is less than what the sanctions are costing in a single day. That's why it's ridiculous, and it was just, I mean, it was more of a show than anything else. Also meant to challenge the unity of the armed forces, but in the end, it was not successful despite you know, their best efforts to create incidents at the border, and in particular at the Simon Bolivar Bridge.
And what about the people living nearby?
Well, there were also some violent protests on the Venezuelan side of the border. I mean, this is not unexpected. I mean, when we had the violent violent protests, street protests called guarimbas in 2014 and 2017, this border state of Táchira was very much a hot place where these confrontations took place. And you know, I mean, this is not speculation. This is also an area with very strong infiltration from Colombian paramilitaries. Right. And so they also tried to create some flashpoints on the Venezuelan side of the border, which led to violent clashes and some casualties, unfortunately. But you know, it did not escalate to something larger, which we should be happy about. And I think the situation is much calmer at the border right now.
What about the role of militia?
Well, the Bolivarian militia is also something that's not very well understood outside. So Venezuela has a traditional armed forces, and also has the Bolivarian militia, which are organized as popular defense committees in the neighborhood.
You're right.
So in the event that any significant military action would take place against Venezuela, these militias have been organizing on self-defense at the local level. So this is another, we can say, another layer of defense against international aggression.
You're right. So tell us about the solidarity letter you entered at the headquarters of the Consulate General of the Republic of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela in Hamburg.
Yeah, so I lived in Hamburg for 3 years, from 2015 to 2018, and the Venezuelan consulate there was very active in trying to inform the German public about the reality in Venezuela, and I had the chance to be involved in several of these activities. And I sent actually letters on more than one occasion when we saw this sort of an increase in the international aggression in the media against Venezuela. And so I felt it was important to clarify the situation and to show solidarity at a time of need, we can say.
How is the offensive of imperialism against the Venezuelan people characterized? We have been talking on that, but it's very important for us to refresh for the audience who is watching us now.
Yeah.
The main characteristics.
Yeah, there are several descriptions. I mean, some people talk of multi-pronged attacks. I mean, some people talk of a fourth or fifth generation war. I don't really like these terms. I think this is a classic imperialism as already understood by Lenin 100 years ago. I mean, there are naturally differences, but I would select two main characteristics. You know, there's a military threat that's there, and we can talk about it in a bit. But the two that I would choose are, on one hand, the media, and on the other hand, sanctions. So the media, and this is not just my opinion, this is not just hearsay, it has been studied that the media has been very hostile to the Bolivarian process since the very beginning, and for various reasons. I mean, it has to do with the corporate nature of the media, it has to do with the fact that when correspondents come to Caracas, they are only shown a very selective part of reality, which is also what the opposition tries to broadcast outside, and so this makes for a very biased narrative outside. And whenever the aggression escalates, this comes in lockstep with an increased aggression in the media. So, for example, before the Constituent Assembly in 2017, when we had a very tense moment on the streets with lots of violence and you know,
the radiation of the guarimbas,
gruesome scenes of deaths caused by the Venezuelan opposition on the streets, we also saw a significant campaign from the media trying to create a sort of frenzy that would, in a way, justify the actions of the Venezuelan opposition. So this was one example. We saw it again trying to delegitimize the May 2018 elections before they took place, and we see it again now. You know, even though in some cases they try to disguise it, what they do is they create a kind of a background narrative that serves to justify a coup or a military intervention. So it's very important, and this is one of the things that Venezuelan analysis tries to do, to counter this narrative, to show that, you know, despite the mainstream media appearing to be unanimous in their narrative about Venezuela, this is not the whole truth. You know, there are voices that are not being heard, there are facts that are being misrepresented, and of course there are lies that are very blatant. So this is on one perspective. The other is economic sanctions, and this is something that's also very misunderstood and very misrepresented by the media. You know, there's this idea that sanctions only target individuals, and so the Venezuelan people are not affected, and this is complete nonsense. You know, and this goes back several years. I mean, we can say that the starting point is the Obama decree in 2015 that declares Venezuela an unusual and extraordinary threat to the United States, which is completely unthinkable. I mean, I don't know how people can read this out loud with a straight face. And so this was the starting point of an escalating aggression, which had as its one of the main renewed intents the financial sanctions against PDVSA in August 2017.
Right.
And so, for example, the Francisco Rodriguez, who is very much an anti-government analyst, is the chief of Torino Capital in the United States. He himself made a study that estimated how oil production would evolve in Venezuela, and his conclusion was that these sanctions in particular caused $6 billion in losses in oil revenue alone over 12 months. So this is something very significant. So that's one aspect, and now we've seen an escalated aggression against the oil industry in Venezuela with this oil embargo that was imposed in late January. That's going to cause 11 billion losses according to initial estimates. But this is we could say the direct effects of sanctions. There are also indirect effects which are also equally deadly, which has to do with what we can call a financial blockade. And so this is financial institutions, banks, refusing to work as intermediaries for international transactions. So for example, if Venezuela wants to buy medicine from some company abroad, and the government has the money to pay, and it will work the transaction through an intermediary bank, and then after weeks or months the bank will refuse to work and will return the money and the medicine does not arrive. And so this is also something that's very costly, and which forces the government to look for indirect ways of getting these imports of food and medicine to arrive, which then arrive much later and at a much greater cost. And so sanctions have a deadly effect, and this is not the first time we're seeing it. We saw it in Iraq in the 1990s, and the goal is very clearly to exacerbate the economic crisis as much as possible as a way to force the Maduro government out of power.
Now, the Carnation Revolution helped independence of Mozambique. What role can the peoples of the world powers play in stopping war and interference?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. I would caution against using too many parallels because, you know, Portugal cannot be considered a power in any meaningful sense of the word. And it was actually the other way around. It was the independence struggle in Mozambique and in Angola and in Guinea which precipitated the revolution in Portugal. So it can go both ways. So on one way, the class struggle in let's say, the third world can inspire the working class in first world countries to also act in solidarity, and on the other hand, the working class can also work in developed countries, like we saw, for example, the most classical example is the anti-war movement in the 1960s and 70s against the war in Vietnam. That was a very important piece in defeating U.S. efforts to destroy the North Vietnamese efforts at national liberation. So it's a two-way effect, and in the end, what it's about is solidarity in the sense of identifying that the struggle is in common with the wretched of the world everywhere. So the working class in developed countries has to understand that they have to find common cause with the working class in the developing world.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So what parallels do you find between the interference of the world powers in Latin America and Africa?
Well, in a sense, both Latin America and Africa have similar positions in what we can call the international division of labor. So given capitalism's natural development, they are seen as primary producers of, let's say, products like coffee or corn, or as primary extraction, natural resources like oil or gold or whatever. So in that sense, the perspective of the world powers towards Latin America and Africa is similar. Concerning the methods of interference, there are different ways about it. So I would draw a parallel. So when the independence movements took place in Africa, starting in the 1950s and 60s, they had very much a progressive element to them. So if we think about Ghana or Guinea or Tanzania with people like Nkrumah, Sekou Touré, and Nyerere, this was very much strongly opposed, not just by the US, but also by France and the United Kingdom, which had been the former colonizers. So we can draw a parallel from this to what we can consider a wave of second independence, which we saw in Latin America in the past 20 years. So we saw, revolutionary governments like the one in Venezuela, but also progressive governments of different types throughout the continent. And this also generated very strong opposition and reaction from the US. Concerning the methods of interference, the issue is that these economies in the third world, by their own nature, are very fragile, and so they are reliant on aid. And in the case of African countries, they have very strong dependence on aid coming from the US. And that allows, not just the US, but also Europe, so that allows world powers to dictate economic policy without needing to resort to more drastic measures like sanctions like we see that we see in Venezuela. And also other bodies of imposing power like the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank also create these relations of dependence that, again, work for the benefit of transnational corporations which are interested in these natural resources and kind of forbid any meaningful independence in the economic sense, both in Africa and Latin America. So it's the parallels are there, the strategies are similar, but perhaps to different degrees.
Well, Ricardo, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. A pleasure.
Ricardo Vaz, political analyst and editor at Venezuela Analysis here in Caracas, Venezuela. I've been talking with him for some minutes for you to understand better what's going on here in Venezuela. This is From Caracas. I am Rey Gómez. Thank you very much.